Well, thank you very much for inviting me, and what a pleasure it is to be here. An absolute pleasure. As you may know, I'm going on my sixth and definitely my final lecture tour to America tomorrow morning. So I was just thinking about what I could come and say to you, which might be of some value. And I thought, well, you know, my theme for 2 weeks in America is the special relationship, the Anglo-American special relationship. Does it exist? Did it ever exist? And if it does exist, where's it going? And I thought that it carries so much background as to the constitutional and legal issues that we share with America. I thought it was a very good idea to revise how we got where we are over the years. Now, all I hear about at the moment is trade. Trade, the single market, when we're talking about Brexit. It's all about trade and what GDP might be in 10 years' time, or what tariff there might be on a BMW if we don't get a deal and it's WTO. How have we sunk so low that we don't talk about our constitution, the principles of English law, our constitutional monarchy, our heritage? It's disgusting that we're talking about how much extra we might have to pay for a BMW if we do a no-deal Brexit. What kind of people are running the country? What kind of people are running mainstream media? I don't give a shit how much a BMW is going to cost. I want my country back, thank you. Now, I've cut this down because I don't want a Friday afternoon lecture when, of course, I was in double Latin at school, staring out of the window, looking at the cricket nets and the football pitches, wishing I was out there. And it is Friday afternoon. The weekend does start here. So I don't want it to be too tedious, but I do think that we need to start thinking again about the principles of English law, our constitution, and how we got here. And forget about this beastly trade business. Now, it's the special relationship, which I think has becoming more and more important, if indeed it exists, and I believe it does exist. I think we're sort of joined at the hip. I am an Atlanticist, and I can't help being a little bit disturbed by what is going on at the moment when I see a military build-up to protect Al-Qaeda and ISIS, who are the guys we're fighting in London and Manchester, being protected in Syria. I don't get it. I simply don't get why we're doing this. Let Putin sweep them all up. Let Putin sort them out. Let the Russians sort them all out. I'm fed up with this war, never-ending warfare that seems to go on. We're not getting the peace dividend that we should have had. A lot of ex-servicemen here, I am one, we should have had a peace dividend. When the wall came down, the collapse of the Soviet Union, we should have had a peace dividend. And we were warned of this, of course, were we not, by General Eisenhower in 1960. I don't know whether you've seen the clip. Don't let the country be taken over by the industrial military congressional Congress. And I think that is what is happening. And a lot of my American friends are getting equally worried about it. But let's go back to the legal situation. Let's go back to the constitutional situation. Let's go back to law, the concept of our law, the beginning of the principles of English law. Take us back to King Alfred the Great, going back to 800 or 900 AD, going back many, many years. And the concept of common law and judicial precedence, which is actually Saxon law. And the idea was that, of course, it was local. The local communities, the local villages actually made the law and enforced the law, natural law in the main, common sense law, if you will. And if it was a particularly serious offence, it might have gone up to the local lord of the manor. It might have gone up the hierarchy a little bit. But of course, the whole concept of law, and law is how we are governed, was local. So we can go back right to 800 and 900 AD, because that's when democracy was local. And we've moved gradually away from that, decade after decade, century after century. So we're now got to this extraordinary situation where we're governed and our law is by places overseas, not even London, but overseas. Strasbourg, I won't mind betting most of you have never even been there. We shouldn't be being, our law shouldn't be based these days. Our final court of appeal should not be an international court in Strasbourg. I've never heard of anything quite so stupid. Now, principles of judicial precedence and law and common law were so good that in 1066, when the Normans invaded, and they brought a lot of architectural advantages, a lot of skill, a lot of engineering skill. But the Normans were great integrationists. They married locally, they married Saxon aristocracy, and they integrated. And that's a very interesting historical perspective. And they saw that the Saxon law that we had, judicial precedence and common law, was a good system of law, and they adopted it. So they adopted it in 1066 in a gradual process. And of course, the thing is with law, and we've learnt this, have we not? And we have to relearn it all the time. It's all very well you having a good constitution and a good system of law, which is the concept of government by consent, which is what we all believe in here, and we all believe in, of course, in America, government by consent. But that's always being chipped away. That's always being chipped away because there will always be somebody turning up who wants to take it away from you. It might be a mad king, it might be a mad emperor, a despot of some time, a lunatic president. Doesn't matter who it actually is. People want to take it away from you. And that is, of course, isn't it exactly what happened as we had the run-up to the beginning of the 1200s. We had possibly the worst king that we've ever had, King John, who chipped and chipped away at the concept of government by consent and the principles of English law as they then were. And of course the barons revolted, and in 1215 they insisted that we have a document that would enshrine that system, or the very early system of law and the principles therein: presumption of innocence, no cruel and unusual punishment, trial by one's peers. All this came around in Magna Carta in 1215. What a hell of a long time ago that was, as base camp for the system of law, which is the system of law both for America and for the United Kingdom. And of course, as we go through that, we see that we've had upsets, we've had civil wars. The first civil war, of course, was Matilda and King Stephen. If you go back to them, a very unpleasant war, nasty, England in ruins for 17 years. Then we had the Wars of the Roses, many battles around here, of course, many quite close to here. And then we had the Civil War in the 1600s between the Royalists and the parliamentarians. And of course, King Charles I, he wanted to get away from the concept of a parliamentary democracy. He believed in divine right, and everything should be done his way, perfectly straightforward, and that's what he wanted. And the battles and the civil war that followed. And of course, eventually, he was so vain and deceitful and stupid, we had to chop his head off. Serves the bugger right, as far as I'm concerned. We then had a crack at a republican system. We had a crack at the Commonwealth with Cromwell, which sort of worked a little bit by and by, but when Cromwell died, we didn't really know what to do. So republicanism for America might be a good thing, or it might not. History will judge. We've got to wait and see. It's still a very young country. I would argue that it didn't work for us. We like a constitutional monarchy. And I just pause a second here to talk about the concept of a civil war. Now, a civil war in England, or Spain, if you will, the European concept of a civil war is brother against brother, brother against father, cousin against cousin, wanting a different system of government. A civil war wanting a system of government, a different system of government. It isn't regionally, it isn't territorially based in any way. It's what the Cavaliers wanted. They wanted one system of government. The Roundheads wanted another system of government. It followed through in Spain with the fascists and the nationalists and the Republicans and so on and so forth. That's a civil war. Now, the Americans, it's probably one of those tricks of language. They regard their civil war in 1861 to 1865 as a civil war. It wasn't a civil war at all. it was a war between the Confederacy in the south and the Unionists in the north. And it went on for 4 years, and for 2 years after the war, there was an army of occupation in the Confederacy. Now, I'm not arguing the rights and wrongs of the South or the North. What I'm saying is they didn't have a civil war. They had a war from the North and the South. Not the same thing at all. And it's important that everybody holds in exactly what a civil war is. So we, by and by, have these upsets, and we had them in the 1600s, of course. And America, the American colonists were growing. It was becoming gradually more prosperous in the colonies in the 1600s and the 1700s. And of course, then certain developments came along, as they will in colonies and they will in empire. And there were the wars, the Indian Wars, sometimes referred to as the Indian Wars, and sometimes referred to as the French Wars, because the French, it was the redcoats, the British, they had to defend the colonists from Indians and from the French. Now, of course, wars and armies have to be paid for. They have to be paid for. And of course, they're always historically paid for by taxation. And the British, and bear in mind when we're dealing with the American colonists, they were only second or third generation English, with a few Scots. But broadly speaking, the immigrants, the colonists, were English. And George Washington, for those of you who have visited Selby Abbey, you'll find George Washington's coat of arms. You'll find his coat of arms in Selby Abbey. And it's supposed, perhaps, that the coat of arms, which was the basis for the Stars and Stripes, the United States Stars and Stripes, you can see it there when you see that window. You can make the case, although it's difficult to prove one way or the other. But you could certainly make that case. And, of course, George Washington was third-generation colonialist, but he was English. And the relationship then was very much as it was, perhaps, if you go back to the 1920s and 1930s with the British and the Australians and the New Zealanders. Quite a close relationship, a very close relationship. And if you look at the names, all the names of those advocating and fighting for independence in the War of Independence, you'll see that they're all English names with a few Scottish names. So really, it was a squabble. It was almost a family squabble. Now, why did that come about? Well, because it was political ineptitude, as these things often are. We had George III, who was unwell a lot of the time. We had administration from Lord North, which was incompetent. And so the taxation was put forward in a rather crass manner. It wasn't done particularly sympathetically, if you can tax sympathetically, which is always a difficult thing to do. People don't like paying taxes. And what was interesting, of course, which I see some works of scholarship on the American side of the pond, which aren't particularly accurate, the American colonist was a very free man. He lived a very free life indeed, the American colonist, very much freer than his English counterpart back in London. And he was more lightly taxed. So the revolution wasn't about tax in its own way. It was about representation. And of course, that's when it started, did it not? No taxation without representation. And this was their call. It wasn't particularly how much tax they were being asked to pay. It was the fact they didn't feel they had representation. And of course, we had the Bill of Rights when we kicked out the Stuarts in 1688. We had the Bill of Rights. And we had the Toleration Act, which gave freedom of religion, freedom of worship, which is something we don't talk about very often these days, but it was a significant act at the time, same time, 1688, and we had the right of petition. So we had all these democratic rights, these parliamentary rights, constitutional rights, legal rights, came around about 1688. And again, because things had been pushed back and backwards and forwards and ebbed and flowed, the American colonists were getting fed up with being taxed without representation. They did actually make their case. They made their case to England. They made their case to King George, and they said, look, we're loyal subjects of the king. We're loyal subjects of the king. We just feel that we want the same protections of the Bill of Rights and everything else that Englishmen get back at home. And it was only crass stupidity that that didn't happen. and it was done very badly by the British government. And if you remember also from your history, there was a lot of support for the American colonists at the time. There was a lot of support. Thomas Paine, Edmund Burke were all supporters of the views of the American colonists. And it was only 5 years or so before 1776 when the Declaration of Independence came about, when the American colonists were actually saying we're loyal to the king. And of course it dragged on for 3, 4, 5, 6 years, and in the end they lost patience and said, no, we're going to have independence. And then we had the War of Independence, and then of course we had independence. Had it been handled differently, had it been handled more sympathetically, America would have become a dominion in the same way that Australia and New Zealand became dominions. And so they would have had dominion status, and that would be interesting. It's a great quiz question for undergraduates, is it not? What would have happened if America had had dominion status instead of under the crown, instead of the system that they had? And that's quite interesting, not the subject of this afternoon, and it also makes me rather unpopular when I'm in America. So I would argue that they'd have been rather better off under dominion status. No. But so we have these things. Now, we have these things enshrined in the Bill of Rights, the Toleration Act, and of course the American Constitution was based on these things. If you read the American Constitution, you'll find it was very much akin. It's a sort of flip side of the coin of the 1688 Bill of Rights, because that's what they wanted. And paradoxically, the colonialists, the people like Thomas Jefferson and John Adams and all these other people who were putting that together, that constitution together, which was largely written in the main by Thomas Jefferson, was a wise man. He saw the foibles of humankind. He saw the pitfalls of humankind. He knew that in years to come, people would try and nibble away at those freedoms. People would try and nibble away at that constitution for their own personal benefit. And I would argue that they've done that in spades in America, and they're doing it here to our own constitutional rights under the 1688 Bill of Rights that we had, that was the formation of that document. Because politicians can't wait to steal power away from you. They want to bring the power to them because they're so much cleverer than ordinary people. They are so clever, it's almost unbelievable that they're so clever. Although when you look at their CV, you have to notice that they haven't actually done anything at all, but they are very, very clever. So they know how to run our businesses. They have no commercial experience. So what do we do when we're talking about Brexit? We send civil servants and politicians to negotiate a trade deal. All of them at university made the decision not to go anywhere near commerce because they thought it was grubby and nasty. I'm going into politics, so I'm going into the civil service. So we send them to negotiate without even negotiation training. And then we wonder why it's all gone to rat poo. Well, it was bound to, wasn't it? It was bound to. And of course, how do they manage to take all this away from us? How do they manage to salami slice our independence and our rights and our birthrights? How do they do that? Well, first of all, they made absolutely sure that they take over the educational system. It's the same in America. The state runs the education system, and the state runs the education system here in Britain. And so the curriculum is written by the state. So it means that most people are ignorant of their birthrights. So older people, generally speaking, have the benefit of a traditional education. But I would argue we have two generations now, which both in America and this country don't have the benefit of education. I was giving a lecture at Durham University last year, and I was talking about Magna Carta, and I was getting a sea of blank faces from third-year history undergraduates. I could see it wasn't seeping in. I said, you're not getting, have you done this? So, where are you with this? I don't want to patronize you. I don't want to tell you stuff you already know. And there was a lady in the front seat, and I said, what are you reading? In history, what bit of history? She was doing women's rights 1870 to 1890. I said, well, don't call yourself a historian. They couldn't even give me the date of Magna Carta. We saw, did we not, David Cameron on television 3 years ago, embarrassingly, being interviewed about Magna Carta. He couldn't even discuss it. Eton and Oxford. But nobody wasted any money on his education, did they? Eton and Oxford. But the lemon couldn't even understand it. What was that man all about? His legacy politically for 6 or 7 years in office is chaps marrying other chaps. Well, that's jolly good if you like that kind of thing. I'm not against it, but it's not much of a political legacy, is it? So until we get back an education system where people understand what their rights are under law, the general principles of English law, the concept of habeas corpus, which of course is taken away by politicians when it's convenient so they can lock everybody up. And now we're seeing that kind of censorship going on in social media, with people getting banned from Twitter, banned from Facebook and stuff. I've had some podcasts taken down by Facebook, probably a bit too truthful for the people who are on Facebook. But so that we're getting this concept of censorship all the time. And they can only do this when people don't know what they've got. And I often use the analogy in my drawing room. In my drawing room, it's full of bric-a-brac and knickknacks. Yours is probably the same. It's full of shit, really. So you can find a snuff box, a Georgian snuff box, silver snuff box, which is worth value, next to a plastic gondola, a present from Venice. You know, that's the kind of tat we bring home from our holidays. And it's the drawing room is full of it. So, but we don't know what's in there. So any visitor could come along and actually pocket anything they like because we don't know what's there. Well, it's the same, is it not? With more recent generations, you can take away habeas corpus, you can install censorship, which is politically correctness, so it's self-censorship. You're too frightened to say something in case somebody gives you a hard time, so you end up in self-censorship. All these things that they try and do, and that is one of the problems that we've got. And the only way we can do that is by education, and the best way of doing that is get the state out of it. Don't let the state write down what we can tell our children or how our children are going to be educated, because otherwise the local teacher has no appreciation of history, has no understanding of history, doesn't understand our legal systems, our constitutional systems, doesn't like them. There's a degree of hatred of our own country that we find in the educational system in this country, and I'm sure you've come across it. Now, as far as the relationship goes at the moment, well, of course, I was a baby boomer, so my father was a fighter pilot, my mother was a senior NCO in the Women's Royal Air Force. All my uncles were Army, Navy or Air Force, and on Armistice Day there was a smattering of DFCs all over the place, and military medals and military crosses, all that kind of thing. But that wasn't a particularly new thing there. I mean, everybody in our avenue had, everybody had medals on Armistice Day. Everybody. So everybody had done their bit. It wasn't a question, we didn't go right down to this hero thing. I'm not too comfortable, you're veterans here, and I'm a vet myself. All this hero business, we do meet heroes, but I rather suspect most of us here who have had previous service wouldn't consider themselves to be heroes. We did our bit, we shined our boots, and we kept our nose clean, tried to stay out of trouble. But heroes are very, very few. So let's get some of that kind of thing into perspective, I think. We need to do that. Now, the Americans lead foreign policy today. They lead foreign policy. And it makes me a little bit uncomfortable when, getting back to Eisenhower's speech, Eisenhower's worry about the industrial military complex. And if you remember Kennedy, those of you remember Kennedy's speech and his fear of the CIA that had gone rogue. And we know that there are false flag attacks going on. We know this is happening in Syria. We know that the destabilization of Libya has done no good, the Middle East and the Horn of Africa. And of course, who picks up the problem? We pick up the problem with mass immigration from these destabilized countries, which of course we can't possibly cope with. So one of the things that needs to be understood, and most of my American friends understand it as well, this needs to be addressed, this needs to be sorted out before things get any worse. And if you look at President Trump's rhetoric before the election, he said he was going to sort it out. He stood on the campaign to bring the boys home, basically, because he was doing no good. America was doing no good. And suddenly that's been turned around by the Nikki Haley's and the John Boltons and the neocons in Washington, most of whom appear to me to be barking mad. But we'll have to We'll have to see how this pans out, but no good is going to come of this, and it looks like we're going to be sucked in as well. I really don't think it's worth a single young serviceman, British serviceman's life for a piece of dusty real estate in a part of the world that we don't even give a care about, really. I just don't think it's worth it. Defence is defence. I'm a big believer in strong defence. I'm a big believer in very strong defence. No question about it, but I believe in that word defence. It's the Ministry of Defence. It's not the Ministry of Attack. It's the Ministry of Defence. So I believe in a strong army, a strong navy, a strong air force to defend our island, defend our islands here. Not to get ourselves involved in European wars. I don't want a European army. Ye gods, have you ever visited the Menin Gate? I'm sure a lot of you have. Or the Somme. Do we really want to go down that route again, taking these people's irons out of the fire? Do we really want 1 million dead of British Empire, 1914-18? 1 million dead, and the French didn't even say thank you, did they? So let them all stew in their own juice, and we'll defend the English Channel, and devil take the hindmost is my view. So I'll leave you with one thought from me, and that is common sense. Common sense in tax, common sense in defence, common sense in immigration. None of this is difficult, and of course the disconnect, as you rightly say, your previous speaker was making the point, the disconnect is really quite extraordinary, because I spend rather more time than I should in Yorkshire pubs, according to my wife. The thing I love about Yorkshire is you get old-fashioned common sense. It doesn't matter whether you go to Barnsley or go to Howden or you go to, it doesn't matter where you go, they'll tell it like it is, and it's common sense. It seems to me that all the lunacy seems to come from the London public sector middle class who visit Tate Modern and see poo-poo on blankets thinking they're seeing fine art, The whole country is run by people who need psychiatric help, as far as I can see. So back to common sense, and I wish you well. I sincerely wish you well. And in any way I can help without joining political parties, I've had enough of being a member of a political party. And I still do about 3 or 4 radio shows, BBC radio shows, or LBC, or talk radio a week. And the reason I get these platforms very often is because I am not a member of a political party, and it's much better for me to be able to do that and say they're good. So people say, oh, well, Godfrey, what do you think of XYZ party? And if I like it, I say, jolly good chaps. So it's easier for me to slip that one in, but not by being a member than being a member, if you could take my point. But anyway, well, thank you for inviting me again, and it's been a great pleasure. And again, I wish you the very, very best of luck indeed.